The rusted hinges of the buried tool shed groaned as firefighters cleared away decades of ash and scorched earth. Inside the collapsed structure, barely visible beneath rotting timber and forest debris, lay something that would crack open a mystery dormant for 66 years. When the skeletal remains were lifted into daylight, nobody at the scene could have imagined they were about to expose a supervisor's rage, a family's guilt, and the truth about a young logger who never ran away at all. But the real shock would come when investigators found the letters, yellowed and water-stained, hidden in an old trunk at a deceased woman's estate sale 3 provinces away. The words, written in shaking cursive, would confirm what some had whispered for generations. Vincent Harper hadn't abandoned his dreams or his family. He'd been silenced. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of October 14th, 1958, arrived cold and gray across the forests of northern Alberta. Vince Harper woke before dawn in the bunkhouse he shared with 11 other men, their snores forming a rough symphony in the darkness. At 21 years old, Vince had worked at the Clearwater logging camp for nearly 3 years, his lean frame hardened by the physical demands of felling timber in one of Canada's most unforgiving wilderness regions. He pulled on his wool shirt, already stiff from yesterday's sweat, and laced his leather boots with practiced efficiency. Outside, frost clung to every surface, turning the world into something brittle and sharp. Vince had been awake most of the night, his mind churning over the confrontation he knew was coming. For weeks he had noticed discrepancies in the camp's supply logs, small at first, but growing bolder. Tools disappeared and reappeared. Fuel counts never matched consumption. Most troubling were the timber tallies that Howard Gerald Pickens submitted to the main office in Edmonton, numbers that seemed inflated compared to what the men actually cut and hauled. Vince had kept his own records, scribbled in a small notebook he kept tucked in his jacket pocket, comparing them against the official sheets posted in the supervisor's office. The gap was undeniable now. Howard Pickens ran Clearwater Camp with an iron fist wrapped in false joviality. At 47, he was a thick-bodied man with hands like slabs of granite and a temper that could flip from backslapping friendliness to explosive rage in seconds. The loggers feared him more than they respected him, and those who complained about working conditions or questioned his decisions often found themselves reassigned to the most dangerous cutting zones or simply let go without explanation. But Pickens had connections with the lumber company owners, relationships built over decades, and his word carried weight that a young logger's accusations never could. Vince hadn't wanted to believe the worst. He'd tried to rationalize the inconsistencies, to tell himself that maybe he'd made errors in his own counts or misunderstood how the company kept its records. But the evidence had mounted until ignoring it felt like complicity. 3 days ago, he'd mentioned his concerns to Marcus DeLuca, an older logger who'd worked camps across British Columbia and Alberta for 20 years. Marcus had listened with a grave expression, then pulled Vince aside after dinner, speaking in low, urgent tones near the equipment shed. "You've got a good heart, kid, but you're playing with fire," Marcus had warned, his weathered face tight with concern. "Pickens has buried problems before. Literally, some say, though I've never seen proof. Men who cross him have a way of disappearing or getting hurt in accidents that don't quite add up." But Marcus had also said something else that stayed with Vince. "If you're right, and he's skimming from the company and lying on the books, that's theft on a scale that could put him in prison. A man facing that kind of ruin will do desperate things." Vince had spent 2 more days wrestling with his conscience, the notebook feeling heavier in his pocket with each passing hour. He thought about his mother back in Medicine Hat, widowed 5 years now, and depending on the money he sent home each month. He thought about his younger sister Clara, just starting high school and dreaming of college, something their family could barely afford. The smart move would be to keep his head down, finish the season, and find work at a different camp come spring. But Vince Harper had never been particularly good at taking the smart move when it conflicted with doing what felt right. His father, killed in a mining accident when Vince was 16, had instilled in him a stubborn sense of justice that sometimes overrode common sense. "A man stands up," his father used to say, "even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." So, on that frigid October morning, Vince made his decision. He would confront Pickens privately. Give the man a chance to explain or correct the situation before taking it higher. It seemed like the decent thing to do, the approach that might resolve the problem without destroying anyone's livelihood or reputation. Looking back with the terrible clarity of hindsight, it was the choice that sealed his fate. Breakfast in the mess hall was the usual affair: strong coffee that could strip paint, fried eggs with questionable provenance, thick slices of bread, and bacon that was more fat than meat. The men ate with single-minded focus, knowing they needed fuel for the brutal day ahead. Temperatures would barely climb above freezing, and the work quota Pickens had set for the week was aggressive even by the camp's harsh standards. 2 crews were behind schedule due to equipment breakdowns, and Pickens had made it clear that everyone would be working longer hours until they caught up. Vince forced down his food, though his stomach felt tight with nervous energy. Across the room, Pickens sat at the supervisor's table with the crew foreman, laughing at something one of them had said. The sound was too loud, too forced, and Vince noticed how Pickens's eyes never quite matched his smile. They were calculating eyes, always measuring, always watching for weakness or challenge. After breakfast, as the men filed out to collect their gear and head to their assigned cutting zones, Vince approached Pickens near the equipment shed. The supervisor was checking a chainsaw, testing the chain tension with his thick fingers. When he noticed Vince standing there, something flickered across his face, an expression gone too quickly to read. "Harper," Pickens said, his tone neutral. "Your crew's heading to Sector 9 today. Better get moving." "Need to talk to you first, Mr. Pickens," Vince said, keeping his voice steady and respectful. "It's important. Maybe somewhere private." Pickens studied him for a long moment, and Vince felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. Around them, other loggers were gathering axes, peavies, and saws, their breath misting in the cold air. The normal morning chaos of a camp preparing for work provided cover for their conversation. "Office, 5 minutes," Pickens said finally, then turned back to his chainsaw inspection. Vince waited outside the small wooden structure that served as the camp's administrative office, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. His right hand found the notebook, and he traced its edge with his thumb, a nervous gesture. Through the office's single window, he could see Pickens inside, sitting behind his desk and writing something in the large ledger where he kept the camp's official records. The supervisor's face was unreadable. When Pickens finally gestured for him to enter, Vince stepped into the cramped space that smelled of tobacco smoke and damp paper. The office was barely large enough for the desk, 2 chairs, and the filing cabinet that held personnel records and supply manifests. A potbelly stove in the corner provided minimal heat, and the walls were covered with safety notices, work schedules, and a large map of the cutting zones marked with pins and colored string. "Shut the door," Pickens said, leaning back in his chair with deceptive casualness. "What's so important, it can't wait." Vince closed the door and remained standing, suddenly uncertain how to begin. He'd rehearsed this conversation in his head a dozen times, but now, facing Pickens across that cluttered desk, the words felt dangerous. "It's about the supply logs and the timber tallies," Vince started, trying to keep his tone neutral and factual. "I've been keeping track of our output, and the numbers don't match what you're reporting to the company." Pickens' expression didn't change, but something in the room's atmosphere shifted. "Is that so?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "You've been keeping your own records." "How enterprising." "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Vince continued quickly, "but the gaps are significant. Tools that go missing from inventory but show up later. Fuel consumption that's recorded higher than what we actually use, and the board feet of timber we're supposedly cutting versus what's actually getting hauled out. There's a difference of maybe 15–20% some weeks." "And you think what, exactly?" Pickens's voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd shouted. "That I'm cooking the books, stealing from the company?" "I'm saying the numbers don't add up," Vince replied, pulling out his notebook. "Look, I've got it all documented here. Dates, quantities, discrepancies. I thought maybe there was an explanation. Something I'm not understanding about how the accounting works." He held out the notebook, a peace offering of sorts, proof that he wasn't trying to go behind Pickens' back, but rather seeking clarification. For a moment, Pickens just stared at the small, leather-bound book. Then his hand shot out with surprising speed and snatched it away. Pickens flipped through the pages, his face darkening as he scanned Vince's careful notations. The young logger had documented everything with painstaking detail, dates and figures that tracked 3 months of discrepancies. It was damning evidence, the kind that could trigger a company audit and potentially criminal investigation. "You stupid kid," Pickens said finally, his voice still that dangerous quiet. "You have any idea what you've done here?" "I'm giving you a chance to explain," Vince said, though his confidence was starting to erode under Pickens's cold stare. "If there's a legitimate reason for the differences." "A chance to explain," Pickens repeated, and now there was something ugly in his tone. "That's generous of you. Tell me, Harper, who else have you shown this to? Who else have you been running your mouth to?" "Nobody," Vince said quickly, which was mostly true. He hadn't shown the notebook to Marcus, only talked about his concerns in general terms. "I wanted to come to you first." "First," Pickens said, standing up slowly. He was several inches taller than Vince and used that height advantage now, moving around the desk to loom over the younger man, implying there'd be a second step, maybe taking this to the company office in Edmonton, or to the authorities. "Only if necessary," Vince said, his mouth going dry. He could smell the coffee on Pickens's breath, see the muscle twitching in the supervisor's jaw. "Look, if something wrong is happening, it needs to be corrected. But if it's just a misunderstanding." "You're right about one thing," Pickens cut him off. "Something wrong is happening. Some kid with delusions of being a detective is threatening to destroy my reputation with a bunch of numbers in a notebook that doesn't prove a damn thing." "It proves the numbers don't match," Vince insisted, his own temper starting to rise despite his fear. "And if you're reporting false figures to the company, that's fraud. That's serious." Pickens' hand moved so fast Vince barely saw it coming. The supervisor grabbed the front of Vince's jacket, yanking him forward until they were face to face. "You listen to me, you little bastard," Pickens snarled, all pretense of civility abandoned now. "I've been running logging camps since before you were born. I've dealt with punks like you who think they're smarter than everyone else, who think they can waltz in and make accusations." "I'm not accusing," Vince gasped, trying to pull back, but Pickens's grip was iron. "I'm asking—" "You're threatening," Pickens corrected. "And nobody threatens me. Not some snot-nosed kid who doesn't understand how the world works." For a terrifying moment, Vince thought Pickens might hit him right there in the office. But instead, the supervisor shoved him backward, sending Vince stumbling against the wall. The impact rattled the framed safety notices and sent a stack of papers sliding off the desk. "Get out," Pickens said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Get back to work before I fire you right now and have you escorted off company property." Vince straightened, his heart pounding. "My notebook." "Your notebook is mine now," Pickens said, holding it up. "Evidence of an employee harassing his supervisor with unfounded accusations. I'll be filing a formal complaint about your behavior, Harper. Consider yourself on thin ice." The casual way Pickens lied, the smooth inversion of victim and aggressor, sent a chill through Vince that had nothing to do with the October cold. He'd walked into this conversation hoping for resolution and had instead backed himself into a corner. Pickens now had the only physical evidence of the discrepancies, and Vince's word alone would mean nothing against a supervisor with decades of experience and powerful connections. "This isn't over," Vince said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Oh, it's over," Pickens replied, settling back into his chair with disturbing calm. "Trust me on that. Now, get out of my office and get to work." Vince left, his legs feeling unsteady as he walked back toward the equipment shed. Several loggers were still gathering gear, and he forced himself to nod at their greetings, to act as though nothing had happened. But inside, his mind was racing through options, each one seeming more impossible than the last. Marcus DeLuca caught up with him as the crews were heading out. "How'd it go?" the older logger asked quietly, falling into step beside Vince. "Bad," Vince admitted. "Really bad. He took my notebook, said he's filing a complaint about me." Marcus cursed under his breath. "I warned you, kid. Pickens doesn't play fair." "What do I do now?" Vince asked, realizing how young and lost he sounded. Marcus was quiet for a moment as they walked, the morning sun finally starting to burn through the clouds, though it did little to warm the frozen landscape. "You've got two choices," he said finally. "You can drop it, apologize to Pickens, keep your head down, and hope he doesn't fire you anyway. Or you can go over his head, contact the company directly, tell them what you found. Without the notebook, I've got no proof, Vince pointed out. You've got your memory, you've got credibility, or you did until today. And you've got the fact that if the company does a surprise audit, they'll find the same discrepancies you did. Marcus paused, then added, but going that route, you're burning bridges. You'll be blacklisted from every logging camp in Alberta, maybe all of Western Canada. Pickens has friends everywhere. They'd reached the point where the trail split, Marcus's crew heading west, while Vince's went north towards Sector 9. The older logger put a hand on Vince's shoulder, his expression grave. My advice, leave it alone. It's not worth your life or your future. But if you can't, if your conscience won't let you, then get out of this camp tonight. Take the supply truck back to town when it comes this afternoon and don't look back. Make your report from somewhere safe, somewhere public. I can't just run, Vince said, though the suggestion was tempting. Sometimes running is the smart play, Marcus replied, especially when you're up against a man like Pickens. I've seen what happens to guys who cross him. Accidents happen in logging camps, Harper, all the time. With that ominous warning, Marcus headed off with his crew, leaving Vince standing at the trail junction. For a long moment, he considered taking Marcus's advice, imagined himself on that supply truck heading back to civilization. But the thought of his father's voice, of those words about standing up even when it's hard, kept him rooted in place. The workday passed in a blur of physical labor that Vince welcomed. The mindless repetition of swinging an axe, the satisfying bite of steel into wood, the organized chaos of felling massive pines and delimbing them for transport, all of it let him push aside the morning's confrontation and focus on something tangible and immediate. His crew worked Sector 9, a dense stand of old-growth timber that would take weeks to clear. The trees here were giants, some of them 4 feet in diameter, and taking them down required skill and coordination. By mid-afternoon, Vince's arms ached and his hands were raw despite his gloves. The crew took a short break, sharing thermos coffee and the sandwiches they'd packed that morning. Nobody mentioned the argument with Pickens, but Vince noticed the sidelong glances some of the men gave him, the way conversations stopped when he approached. Word had spread, as it always did in the enclosed world of a logging camp. The supply truck arrived at 4, earlier than usual. Vince watched it from his position near the cutting zone, saw the driver unloading crates and fuel drums near the main camp buildings. For a moment, he seriously considered Marcus's suggestion. He could walk down there, tell the driver he had a family emergency, and be gone before Pickens even knew he'd left. But leaving felt like admitting defeat, like validating Pickens's belief that he could bully and threaten his way out of accountability. More than that, it felt like betraying the other men in the camp who were being cheated by Pickens's fraud. The stolen supplies and inflated figures weren't just abstract numbers. They translated to substandard equipment, delayed maintenance, and profit that should have been reinvested in safety and working conditions. When the workday finally ended and the crews trudged back to camp, Vince made his decision. He would wait until after dinner, then approach Douglas Kerrigan, the camp's assistant supervisor. Kerrigan was younger than Pickens, only in his early 30s, and had always struck Vince as more reasonable. If he could convince Kerrigan to look into the discrepancies, to request an audit, maybe there was still a way to address this without it becoming a personal vendetta. Dinner was stew, thick and greasy but hot, served with chunks of bread that soaked up the gravy. Vince ate mechanically, aware of Pickens watching him from the supervisor's table. The older man's expression was unreadable, but there was something predatory in his stillness, like a cat waiting for a mouse to make its move. After the meal, Vince lingered near the mess hall, waiting for a chance to catch Kerrigan alone. But when the assistant supervisor emerged, Pickens was with him, one hand on Kerrigan's shoulder in a gesture that looked friendly but carried an edge of possession. The two men walked toward the office, deep in conversation, and Vince's hope of making an ally of Kerrigan dimmed. As darkness settled over the camp, Vince returned to the bunkhouse with the other men. Some played cards by lamplight, others wrote letters home or read battered paperback novels. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and wood smoke. Vince lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of men settling in for the night. Around 8 o'clock, someone knocked on the bunkhouse door. One of the younger loggers answered it, then called out, "Harper, somebody wants you outside." Vince's stomach tightened. He pulled on his jacket and boots, acutely aware that every man in the bunkhouse was watching him. When he stepped outside into the cold night air, he found Billy Fletcher waiting for him. Fletcher was one of Pickens's favorite employees, a wiry man in his 30s who served as something between an enforcer and an errand boy for the supervisor. "Pickens wants to see you," Fletcher said, his breath misting in the freezing air. "Down at the old equipment shed past the generator house." "What for?" Vince asked, immediately suspicious. The old equipment shed was at the far edge of the camp, beyond the main work areas, a place where broken or outdated tools were stored and eventually scrapped. Fletcher shrugged. "Didn't say. Just told me to fetch you." Every instinct Vince had was screaming at him not to go, that this was a setup. That meeting Pickens alone in an isolated location was exactly the kind of mistake that got men hurt, but refusing would only delay the inevitable confrontation. And at least there would be a witness in Fletcher who could confirm that Pickens had summoned him. "Lead the way," Vince said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They walked through the camp, past the mess hall where cleanup was still happening, past the generator house where the diesel engine chugged steadily, providing power to the few electric lights the camp had. The old equipment shed sat another 100 yards beyond, at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the darkness, except for the yellow glow of a lantern visible through its warped door. "He's waiting inside," Fletcher said, jerking his thumb toward the shed. Then, without another word, the man turned and walked back toward the main camp, leaving Vince standing alone in the dark. For a long moment, Vince considered turning around. Going back to the bunkhouse, packing his things, and leaving on tomorrow's supply run. But the same stubborn pride that had gotten him into this situation kept him moving forward. He pushed open the shed door, which groaned on rusted hinges, and stepped inside. The shed was larger than it looked from outside, a cavernous space filled with the ghosts of the logging operations past. Broken saw blades, damaged peavies, coils of rotted rope, spare parts for machinery long since replaced, all of it cast in harsh shadows by the single lantern hanging from a central beam. The air smelled of rust, old grease, and decay. Pickens stood near the back of the shed, his bulky frame silhouetted against the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. He was holding something in his hands, and as Vince's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he recognized it as a splitting maul, a heavy tool with an axe blade on one side and a wedge-shaped hammer on the other. "You came," Pickens said, his voice carrying an odd note of surprise. "Didn't think you were that stupid, to be honest." "You wanted to talk," Vince replied, staying near the door, every nerve in his body on high alert. "So talk." "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning," Pickens continued, almost conversational now, "about your notebook and your accusations, and I realized something. You're not going to let this go, are you? You're the type who thinks he's a hero, who's going to save everyone from the corrupt supervisor." "I just want what's right," Vince said, his hand finding the doorframe behind him, preparing to bolt if necessary. "What's right?" Pickens repeated, laughing without humor. "You know what's right, kid? What's right is understanding that the world has an order to it. People like me, we keep things running. We make the hard decisions, we cut the corners that need cutting, we do what it takes to keep the operation profitable and the men employed, and people like you, you're supposed to shut up and do your job. Not when the job involves looking the other way while you steal," Vince shot back, his fear giving way to anger. "How much have you taken, Pickens? How much have you skimmed over the years?" Pickens's face hardened. "More than you'll ever see in your pathetic life. And I earned every penny dealing with idiots and keeping this camp running through winters that would have broken lesser men. The company owes me that money." "That's not how employment works," Vince said, his voice rising. "You don't get to just take what you think you're owed." "No?" Pickens stepped forward, the maul gripped tight in his hands. "Then how about this, Harper? How about I take what I need to protect myself, starting with making sure you never tell anyone what you think you know?" The threat was explicit now, hanging in the cold air between them. Vince's hand tightened on the doorframe, his body tensed to run. "You're threatening to kill me over a notebook?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's insane. People know I came out here to meet you. Fletcher brought me. You can't just—" "Can I?" Pickens interrupted. "Accidents happen all the time in logging camps. Kid goes wandering in the woods at night. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he fell and hit his head. Maybe he panicked and ran deeper into the wilderness. Hell, Maybe he just decided to skip out, run away from the job like dozens of guys do every year. "My crew knows I wouldn't run," Vince protested. "Your crew knows you had a fight with your supervisor this morning. They know you've been moody and distracted all day. They'll believe whatever story makes sense, and running away makes perfect sense for a kid who bit off more than he could chew." Pickens moved closer, and Vince finally made his decision to run. He turned to flee through the door, but Pickens was faster than his bulk suggested. The supervisor lunged forward, grabbing Vince's jacket and yanking him back into the shed. Vince stumbled, his boots slipping on the debris-covered floor, and fell hard on his side. "Should have kept your mouth shut," Pickens snarled, raising the maul. What happened next became the subject of debate and speculation for decades, though the truth would only emerge when forensic investigators finally examined the remains found in 2024. Vince rolled as the maul came down, the blade biting into the wooden floor inches from his head. He kicked out desperately, catching Pickens in the knee, and the supervisor stumbled backward with a grunt of pain. Vince scrambled to his feet, looking for a weapon, anything to defend himself with. His hand found a length of rusted pipe, and he swung it wildly at Pickens, who blocked the blow with the maul's handle. The impact sent vibrations up Vince's arms, nearly making him drop the pipe. "Just die already!" Pickens growled, swinging the maul in a vicious arc that Vince barely ducked under. The blade whistled past his ear and clanged against a metal support beam, throwing sparks. The fight was brutal and brief. Vince was younger and quicker, but Pickens had size, strength, and the desperate fury of a man with everything to lose. They grappled among the shed's debris, knocking over crates and sending tools clattering across the floor. At one point, Vince managed to land a solid blow with the pipe against Pickens' shoulder, and the supervisor roared with pain and rage. But in the end, youth and desperation weren't enough against experience and ruthlessness. Pickens caught Vince with the flat of the maul blade, a glancing blow to the side of the head that sent the young logger crashing into a stack of wooden crates. Vince's vision exploded into stars, his legs going weak beneath him. The final blow came as Vince tried to rise, still fighting, still refusing to give up. Pickens brought the maul down with all his strength, and Vince Harper's fight ended in the dirty shadows of a forgotten tool shed, his blood pooling on the warped floorboards. For a long time, Pickens stood over the body, breathing hard, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd done. He'd killed before, though never so directly. A logger who'd threatened to report him for safety violations had fallen from a cutting platform after Pickens tampered with his safety harness. Another who'd gotten too curious about the books had been transferred to a dangerous section where a Widowmaker branch had done the work for him. But this was different. This was murder with his own hands, brutal and undeniable. He couldn't let panic take over. He'd survived decades in this brutal industry by keeping his head in crisis situations. "Think," he told himself. "The body needs to disappear. The story needs to be airtight." Pickens spent the next hour implementing a plan that was both simple and effective. He wrapped Vince's body in old canvas tarps, using rope to secure the bundle. Then, working in the darkness beyond the shed's lantern light, he dug a shallow grave beneath the building's floor, prying up several boards and excavating the soft earth underneath. The ground was already starting to freeze, but he managed to dig deep enough to conceal the body, especially once he placed broken equipment and scrap metal over it to mask any disturbance. By midnight, Vince Harper's corpse was buried beneath the old equipment shed, and Pickens had cleaned up the evidence of their struggle as best he could in the poor light. He scattered fresh wood chips and debris over the bloodstains, rearranged the shed's contents to hide signs of the fight, and took the lantern with him when he left, plunging the space back into darkness. The next morning, when Vince Harper failed to appear for breakfast, Pickens made a great show of concern. He sent men to search the bunkhouse, the latrine, the work areas. When no trace of the young logger could be found, Pickens organized a wider search of the surrounding forest, leading crews in, calling out Vince's name, and checking the trails and cutting zones. By afternoon, Pickens called off the search and gathered the men in front of the mess hall. His performance was masterful, a perfect blend of regret and pragmatic acceptance. "I hate to say it, boys, but I think Harper's run off," Pickens announced, his voice carrying across the assembled loggers. "Some of you know we had words yesterday morning. He was making some wild accusations about the camp's bookkeeping, seemed convinced there was corruption happening. I set him straight on how things actually work, Maybe came down harder on him than I should have. He was upset when he left my office. Several men nodded. They'd seen Vince's agitation after the confrontation, his distraction during the workday. My guess is he decided he couldn't face the embarrassment of being wrong, or maybe he thought he was in more trouble than he was, Pickens continued. Either way, running away is a coward's choice, and I'm disappointed in him. But it happens. Guys get in over their heads, they panic, they bolt. Shouldn't we keep searching? Marcus DeLuca spoke up, his voice skeptical. The kid could be hurt out there, lost. Pickens shook his head. We've covered 5 square miles and found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. If he wanted to disappear, the forest is big enough. If he wanted to head back to civilization, he had plenty of time to reach the highway and catch a ride. We can't spare the manpower for a wild goose chase. What about his family? Another logger asked. Somebody should tell them. I'll handle notifying the company and they'll contact his next of kin, Pickens said smoothly. But between us, I wouldn't be surprised if Harper turns up in a few weeks working some other camp under a different name. It's not uncommon for guys who burn bridges to reinvent themselves. The explanation satisfied most of the men, though Marcus DeLuca continued to watch Pickens with undisguised suspicion. But without evidence or alternative theory, there was nothing to do but accept the supervisor's version of events and get back to work. The company in Edmonton received Pickens's report about Vince Harper's disappearance and filed it away with hundreds of similar cases. Young men working remote camps often vanished, running from debts or responsibilities, or simply from the grinding hardship of the work. A cursory investigation confirmed that Harper's bunk had been cleared out and his personal effects were gone, which Pickens had ensured by disposing of them himself. The case was closed as a voluntary departure. Vince's mother received a letter from the logging company expressing regret at her son's sudden abandonment of his position. The letter mentioned nothing about accusations or arguments, only that Vince had left the camp without notice or explanation. She refused to believe her son would run away without contacting her, but her protests to the company and local authorities went nowhere. Young men disappeared into the wilderness all the time, they told her. Sometimes they came back, sometimes they didn't. For years afterward, Clara Harper would wonder what happened to her brother. She'd been 15 when he vanished, on the cusp of the college education he'd been helping to finance. She managed to attend university anyway, taking on loans and working multiple jobs, driven by a fury at the injustice of Vince's disappearance. She became a social worker, dedicated to helping families navigate bureaucratic systems that failed the vulnerable. But she never stopped looking for answers about her brother. Meanwhile, Howard Gerald Pickens continued running Clearwater Camp for another 8 years. The discrepancies in his bookkeeping grew bolder, his skimming more aggressive, but without anyone to challenge him, he operated with impunity. He eventually retired in 1966 with a comfortable pension and the respect of his industry, moving to a small town outside Calgary where he lived quietly until his death from a heart attack in 1973. But Pickens had never been quite the same after that October night. His sister, Helen Pickens Rourke, noticed the change when Howard visited for Christmas in 1958. He drank more heavily, started at sudden noises, and had a haunted quality in his eyes that hadn't been there before. During a late-night conversation when he was deep in his cups, he'd said something that had stayed with Helen for the rest of her life. "I did something terrible, Helen," he'd confessed, his words slurred, but his anguish apparent. "Something I can't take back. The kid just wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't listen to reason." Helen had pressed him for details, but Howard had clammed up, refused to say more, and the next morning had acted as though the conversation never happened. But she remembered those words, and over the years, as she heard stories about Howard's temper and the suspicious accidents that seemed to follow him, she began to piece together a picture of her brother that terrified her. When Howard died in '73, Helen went through his personal effects and found the notebook. It was tucked in a locked metal box along with some cash, important documents, and a small revolver. The notebook was water-stained and worn, filled with neat handwriting that documented supply discrepancies and timber count irregularities at Clearwater Logging Camp. The dates ran from July through October 1958, and the initials VH were written inside the front cover. Helen knew immediately what she was looking at, even before she found the newspaper clipping tucked in the notebook's back pages. The clipping was from the Edmonton Journal, dated November 1958, a small article about a missing logger named Vincent Harper, who disappeared from a northern camp. The article mentioned that Harper, 21, had last been seen after an argument with his supervisor and was believed to have run away. Helen sat in her brother's empty house, holding that notebook and feeling the weight of its implications. Her brother had kept it all these years, unable to destroy it, unable to let it go. It was evidence of guilt, proof that he'd done something to the young man who tried to hold him accountable. But it was also evidence against herself if she came forward, complicity in covering up a crime she'd only suspected. She made a decision that would haunt her conscience for the rest of her life. She kept the notebook, hiding it among her own possessions, too afraid to destroy it, but too conflicted to turn it over to authorities. Instead, she wrote a letter to herself, detailing her suspicions and the discovery of the notebook, sealed it, and placed it with her will, to be opened upon her death. Helen Pickens Rourke died in March 2023 at the age of 91. Her estate was modest, dispersed among nieces and nephews who barely remembered her. Most of her possessions were sold at an estate sale in Edmonton, including a trunk of old papers and letters that a young archivist named Rachel Feng purchased for $50, thinking some of the documents might be interesting for a local history project she was working on. Rachel spent weeks going through the trunk's contents before she found the sealed letter and the notebook. When she read Helen's confession and realized what she was holding, she immediately contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The investigation that followed moved slowly at first, complicated by the decades that had passed and the deaths of everyone directly involved. But in August 2024, a forest fire swept through the region where Clearwater Logging Camp had once operated. The camp itself had been abandoned in the early 1970s when the timber in the area was depleted and nature had reclaimed most of the structures. The fire burned for weeks, consuming thousands of acres before firefighters finally contained it. During cleanup operations, a crew clearing debris stumbled upon the remains of the old equipment shed. Its roof collapsed and its walls charred, but still partially standing. And beneath the floor, exactly where Helen's letter and forensic analysis of the notebook had suggested they might be, investigators found the skeletal remains of Vincent Harper, still wrapped in the rotted remnants of canvas tarps, surrounded by the rusted tools that had been piled on top of his makeshift grave 66 years earlier. The forensic examination confirmed the identity through dental records that Clara Harper, now 77 and living in Vancouver, had insisted be kept on file with missing persons databases. The cause of death was massive blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy implement like a splitting maul. Further excavation of the site uncovered additional evidence, including a corroded maul head with microscopic traces of bone embedded in its blade. The case officially closed in November 2024 with a press conference where RCMP investigators laid out the full story. They presented the notebook, the letters, the physical evidence, and the timeline that tracked Howard Gerald Pickens' crime from commission to cover-up to eventual exposure. News outlets across Canada picked up the story, fascinated by the decades-long mystery and the determination of a dead woman's conscience to finally reveal the truth. Clara Harper attended the press conference, frail but fierce, her hands gripping the podium as she spoke about her brother. Vince was a good man who tried to do the right thing, she said, her voice breaking. He believed in justice and standing up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it cost him everything. For 66 years, our family lived with not knowing, with the pain of his absence and the questions that had no answers. Now we finally have those answers, and while they don't bring him back, they give us closure. And they prove that the truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually comes to light. Marcus DeLuca had died in 1997, but his daughter, contacted by investigators, confirmed that her father had always believed something terrible had happened to Vincent Harper. Dad never bought the runaway story, she told reporters. He said Vince wasn't the type to abandon his responsibilities or his family. He thought Pickens had killed him, but could never prove it. Before he died, Dad made me promise to keep pushing authorities to investigate if any evidence ever surfaced. I'm just glad he was right, glad that Vince is finally getting justice. The story resonated beyond the particular tragedy of Vincent Harper's death. It became a touchstone for discussions about workplace safety, the vulnerability of young workers in isolated environments, and the importance of creating systems where people can report concerns without fear of retaliation. Several advocacy groups cited the case as an example of why stronger protections were needed for workers in remote industries. For the Harper family, the closure came with profound sadness. They had hoped for decades that Vince might still be alive somewhere, that he'd resurface with some explanation for his disappearance. Learning the truth meant accepting that he'd been murdered, that he'd died trying to do the right thing, and that his killer had lived out his life unpunished. But it also meant they could finally grieve properly, could lay Vince to rest with the dignity he deserved. In April 2025, Vincent Harper was buried in his hometown of Medicine Hat, in a plot next to his parents. The funeral was attended by dozens of people, some who'd known him personally, others who'd only learned his story through the media coverage but felt compelled to pay their respects. Clara Harper, now the last surviving member of her immediate family, stood at the graveside and read from a letter Vince had sent her in September 1958, just weeks before his death. "Dear Clara," the letter read, "I hope this note finds you doing well in school. I'm proud of how hard you're working, and I want you to know that every dollar I send home for your education is worth it. You're going to do great things with your life. I can feel it. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't achieve your dreams just because money is tight or because the world sometimes seems stacked against people like us. Stand up for yourself and for what's right, even when it's hard. That's what Dad would have wanted for both of us. I love you, kiddo. Your brother, Vince." Clara's voice broke on the final words, tears streaming down her weathered face. "He never got to see me graduate college," she said to the assembled mourners. "He never got to see me become a social worker, or have a family, or grow old. Howard Pickens took all of that from him and from us. But Vince's values, his courage, his commitment to doing what was right, those things lived on through everyone he touched. And now, finally, his story is complete. He can rest knowing that the truth came out, that justice, however delayed, was served." The case of Vincent Harper became one of the longest delayed solved homicides in Canadian history, a testament to the power of guilty consciences and determined investigators. It proved that even when everyone directly involved in a crime has died, even when decades have passed and evidence has decayed, the truth can still emerge from the shadows. For Helen Pickens Rourke, who'd lived with the burden of her brother's secret for half a century, her decision to document what she knew and preserve the evidence had been an act of conscience that ultimately gave the Harper family the answers they deserved. Her letter, opened posthumously, had expressed her deep regret for not coming forward sooner, and her hope that, even after her death, she could help right the terrible wrong her brother had committed. In the end, the story of Vincent Harper's disappearance and eventual discovery served as a reminder that the pursuit of justice doesn't have an expiration date. It demonstrated the importance of speaking truth to power, even when that truth comes with personal cost, and it honored the memory of a young man who, faced with a choice between staying silent or standing up for what he believed was right, chose courage over safety and paid the ultimate price for his integrity. The old equipment shed where Vince Harper took his final breaths was dismantled completely during the investigation, every board and beam examined for evidence before being removed. The site itself became something of an unofficial memorial, with people occasionally visiting to leave flowers or notes, though there's no official marker. The land has been returned to wilderness, the forest slowly reclaiming the scars left by logging operations and the fire that followed. On clear autumn days, when the leaves turn gold and the air carries that particular crispness that comes with October in Alberta, locals say the wind through the pines sounds almost like voices, like the whispers of stories that refuse to stay buried. It's a fanciful notion, perhaps, but one that speaks to a deeper truth about memory and justice. Some stories demand to be told, no matter how long they've been silenced. Some voices refuse to be forgotten, no matter how deep they're buried. Vincent Harper was one of those voices, and 66 years after a violent supervisor tried to silence him forever, Vince finally got to tell his story. Not in the way he'd hoped, not with the life and future he'd been robbed of, but with a clarity and power that came from the ultimate vindication. The truth, as his sister said at his funeral, eventually came to light. And in logging camps across Canada, in remote workplaces where young people still face the pressure to stay silent about wrongdoing, where power imbalances still threaten those who speak up, Vincent Harper's story serves as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns of the dangers that can lurk in isolated places when conscience is abandoned in favor of profit and self-preservation. And it inspires those who face similar choices to stand up anyway, to speak truth even when it's dangerous, because some things are worth fighting for, even if you don't live to see the victory. The notebook that Vince Harper had so carefully maintained, documenting the discrepancies that cost him his life, now sits in an RCMP evidence locker, a physical testament to his integrity and attention to detail. The letters written by Helen Pickens Rourke, confessing her knowledge and her regrets, are preserved alongside it. Together, they form a complete record of crime, guilt, and eventual justice. A story that took more than 6 decades to reach its conclusion, but never stopped moving toward resolution. For Clara Harper, spending the final years of her own life finally knowing what happened to her brother brought a complex mixture of grief and relief. The little girl who'd lost her protector and benefactor at 15, who'd wondered for 66 years where he'd gone and why he'd left without saying goodbye, finally understood that he'd never left willingly, never abandoned her, never forgotten his promises. He'd been taken from her by violence and greed, and knowing that truth, as painful as it was, felt better than decades of uncertainty. She established a scholarship fund in Vince's name at the University of Alberta, designated for students from working-class backgrounds studying social justice, criminology, or worker advocacy. The first scholarships were awarded in 2026, and each recipient receives not just financial support, but also a letter telling Vincent Harper's story and explaining the values the fund seeks to honor. In this way, Vince's commitment to doing what's right continues to influence new generations, his voice still speaking through the years. The logging industry itself has changed dramatically since 1958, with stronger safety regulations, better oversight, and more robust systems for reporting misconduct. But the fundamental human dynamics, the tensions between power and accountability, between profit and ethics, those remain constant across time and industries. Vincent Harper's case serves as a reminder that those tensions can turn deadly when the powerful believe they're untouchable, and when systems fail to protect those who speak up. In the quiet moments of Alberta evenings, when families gather for dinner and workers head home from their jobs, when students study late into the night and activists prepare for another day of fighting for change, the story of Vincent Harper lingers as a ghost story of a different sort. Not the supernatural kind, but something more profound, a story about the ghosts we create when we choose silence over truth, about the way buried secrets poison the ground they're hidden in, about the inevitable way that justice, patient and persistent, eventually excavates what was meant to stay hidden forever. And somewhere in the forests of northern Alberta, in the space where Clearwater Logging Camp once stood, and where a young man once died for refusing to look away from wrongdoing, the trees grow tall again, their roots reaching deep into soil that holds both memory and renewal. The forest keeps its secrets until it doesn't, until fire, or time, or human determination brings what's buried back to light. Vincent Harper's story emerged that way, from ash and bone and the testimony of the guilty, a tale that waited patiently through decades until the moment arrived for truth to finally prevail. That moment came 66 years late, long after everyone who could have been legally held accountable had died, long after the immediate pain of loss had been replaced by the dull ache of permanent absence. But it came, as it always does for those with the courage to document the truth and the conviction to believe that someday, somehow, justice will have its day. And in that coming, in that long-delayed resolution, Vincent Harper received the vindication he'd been denied in life, the acknowledgement that he'd been right to stand up, right to speak out, right to believe that integrity mattered more than safety. The lesson of his life and death echoes forward into a future he never got to see. A reminder to every person who faces that crucial choice between comfort and conscience, between going along and standing up. It's a lesson written in the carefully maintained entries of a water-stained notebook, in the guilty confessions of a dead woman's letter, in the forensic evidence uncovered beneath a burned building's floor. It's a lesson that says the truth matters, that courage counts, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Vincent Harper believed those things deeply enough to die for them, And 66 years after Howard Gerald Pickens tried to erase that belief, along with the young man who embodied it, Vince's story proved him right. The truth came out. The cover-up unraveled. The victim received his vindication, and a murder that was meant to be forgotten forever instead became a story that will be told for generations. A story about the persistent power of truth and the ultimate futility of trying to bury what demands to be known. The investigation that followed the discovery of Vince's remains was one of the most complex forensic undertakings in Canadian history, precisely because of the decades that had elapsed between the crime and its exposure. Lead investigator Sergeant Patricia Moreland of the RCMP's Historical Homicide Unit found herself piecing together evidence from multiple eras, tracking down descendants of witnesses, and using modern forensic techniques on evidence that predated most of those technologies. The skeletal remains themselves told a brutal story. Forensic anthropologist Dr. James Chen, brought in from the University of British Columbia, spent weeks examining every bone, documenting the trauma pattern that revealed the violence of Vince's final moments. The skull showed 3 distinct impact sites, each consistent with blows from a heavy blunt instrument swung with considerable force. The angle and location of the fractures suggested the victim had been struck while trying to defend himself, with defensive wounds visible on the forearm bones, where Vince had likely raised his arms to protect his head. What struck me most about this case, Dr. Chen told reporters during a press briefing, was the desperation evident in both the attack and the burial. This wasn't a calculated, coldly executed murder. This was frenzied, emotional violence followed by a panicked attempt at concealment. The killer was terrified of being caught, and that fear is written in every aspect of how the body was disposed of. The soil analysis around the burial site revealed traces of accelerants, suggesting that at some point, possibly years after the initial burial, someone had attempted to burn the shed's contents, perhaps hoping to destroy any remaining evidence. The fire had been insufficient to consume the building or its hidden burden, but it explained some of the charring on the bones and the degradation of certain materials. Investigators theorized that this secondary attempt at destruction might have occurred when Pickens retired and left the area, a final effort to erase any physical trace of his crime. Rachel Feng, the archivist who discovered Helen Pickens Rourke's confession, found herself at the center of media attention she'd never sought or anticipated. A 28-year-old graduate student working on her doctoral dissertation about labor conditions in mid-century Canadian resource industries, she'd bought the trunk of papers on a whim, thinking it might contain interesting primary sources for her research. Instead, she'd uncovered one of the province's longest-running mysteries. "I remember the moment I opened that sealed letter," Rachel said in an interview with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Helen had written it in 2015, 8 years before she died, like she knew her time was running short and wanted to make sure the truth came out eventually. The letter was remarkably detailed, describing exactly where her brother had hidden the body, what he'd confessed to her in his drunken admission, and her own guilt at not coming forward sooner. She wrote that she'd been afraid of tarnishing her family name, afraid of legal consequences for herself, but that the guilt had eaten at her for decades. The letter had also contained information that proved crucial to the investigation. Helen had documented dates, names of other loggers who'd worked at Clearwater Camp during that period, and specific details about the camp's layout that she'd learned from her brother over the years. She'd even included a hand-drawn map, sketched from Howard's descriptions, showing the location of the old equipment shed relative to other camp structures. When investigators compared this map to historical logging company records and aerial photographs from the 1960s, everything matched with startling accuracy. Finding descendants and former associates of people involved in the case presented its own challenges. The logging industry had been itinerant by nature, with workers moving from camp to camp, often leaving minimal paper trails. But Sergeant Moreland's team worked methodically through employment records, union documents, and local historical societies to track down anyone with connections to Clearwater Camp in 1958. They found Douglas Kerrigan's son, now retired and living in British Columbia. The younger Kerrigan, named after his father, remembered his dad talking about a logger who disappeared from one of his early jobs. "Dad always felt guilty about that," Kerrigan told investigators. He said there was something off about the supervisor's story, that the timeline didn't make sense. He remembered Pickens pulling him aside that night, being very emphatic about the runaway explanation, almost coaching him on what to say if anyone asked questions. Dad was young then, only in his early 30s, and Pickens was his boss. He went along with it, but it bothered him for the rest of his life. This testimony, while not admissible in court given that all the principals were deceased, helped investigators understand how Pickens had managed the cover-up so effectively. He'd used his authority to shape the narrative, leveraging his relationships and position to ensure that potential questioners were brought into line before they could raise significant doubts. The discovery also shed new light on other unsolved disappearances from logging camps in the region during Pickens's tenure. RCMP investigators began reviewing old case files, looking for patterns. They identified 3 other instances where workers had allegedly run away from camps under Pickens's supervision, disappearances that had occurred in 1954, 1961, and 1963. While no bodies were found and no definitive evidence linked Pickens to these cases, the pattern raised disturbing questions about how many victims the supervisor might have claimed over his career. Marcus DeLuca's daughter, Sophia, now in her 50s and working as a labor rights attorney in Toronto, spoke passionately about how her father's suspicions about Vince Harper's fate had influenced her own career path. "Dad told me the story when I was a teenager," she explained. He said that Vince Harper had been a good kid trying to do the right thing in a system that punished honesty. He said that if workers couldn't report problems without fear, if speaking up meant risking your life, then something was fundamentally broken in how we organized labor. That conversation planted seeds that eventually grew into my whole career. I've spent 30 years fighting for whistleblower protections and workplace safety regulations, and in a very real sense, I've been fighting for Vince Harper the entire time. The Harper family's response to finally learning the truth was complex and deeply emotional. Clara Harper, interviewed extensively by journalists in the months following the discovery, spoke with a clarity that belied her advanced age. She described the particular cruelty of not knowing, of spending decades oscillating between hope that Vince might still be alive and fear that something terrible had happened to him. "The human mind isn't built for permanent uncertainty," Clara explained. "You keep circling back to the same questions, replaying the last conversation you had, wondering if there were signs you missed. I used to dream about Vince showing up at my door with some explanation for where he'd been. Even as I got older, even as I intellectually understood that he was almost certainly dead, part of me kept that hope alive. Learning the truth was devastating, but it was also a relief. I could finally stop wondering and start grieving properly." Clara also spoke about the financial impact of Vince's disappearance on her family. When he vanished, she'd been planning to start college the following fall, relying on the money he sent home to supplement her mother's meager income. Without his support, those plans had to be abandoned temporarily. She'd spent 2 years working as a secretary and living at home, saving every penny before finally being able to enroll at university at age 17. "I used to be angry about that delay," Clara admitted. "I felt like Pickens hadn't just taken my brother, he'd taken those years from me too. But in hindsight, those years working made me tougher, more determined. And they gave me perspective on how hard life was for working-class families, how precarious everything could be. That perspective made me a better social worker later on. So, in some strange way, even that loss contributed to who I became." The scholarship fund Clara established in Vince's name had grown beyond her initial vision. What started as a modest endowment funded by her own savings had attracted donations from across Canada after the story broke. Labor unions, advocacy organizations, individuals moved by Vince's story, all contributed until the fund reached over $800,000. The first class of Vincent Harper Scholars, awarded in 2026, included 12 students from working-class backgrounds who were studying criminal justice, labor law, workplace safety, and social work. At the scholarship ceremony, Clara addressed the recipients with words that captured both her grief and her determination to find meaning in tragedy. "My brother died because he refused to be silent in the face of wrongdoing," she told the students. "He paid the ultimate price for his integrity." Each of you has chosen fields where you'll be called upon to make similar choices, maybe not as dramatic, but no less important. You'll see injustice and have to decide whether to speak up or look away. You'll encounter powerful people who benefit from maintaining broken systems, and you'll have to decide whether to challenge them. When those moments come, I hope you'll remember Vince's story. I hope you'll remember that standing up matters, even when it's dangerous, even when the personal cost is high. The media coverage of the case sparked broader conversations about workplace safety and whistleblower protections in Canada. Several journalists investigated current conditions in remote work camps, from logging operations to mining facilities to oil and gas installations, and found that while regulations had improved significantly since the 1950s, workers in isolated locations still faced unique vulnerabilities. The power dynamics that had enabled Pickens to operate with impunity hadn't disappeared entirely. They'd simply evolved. A parliamentary committee held hearings on strengthening protections for workers who report safety violations or fraudulent practices, citing Vince Harper's case as an example of what could happen when those protections were inadequate or non-existent. Several labor unions pushed for legislation they called the Vincent Harper Worker Protection Act, which would mandate independent oversight of remote work sites and create secure reporting channels for employees to raise concerns without going through their direct supervisors. The logging company that had employed Pickens and Harper, now operating under different ownership and corporate structure after multiple mergers and acquisitions, issued a formal apology to the Harper family. The statement acknowledged that the company's systems in the 1950s had been insufficient to protect employees from supervisory abuse, and that the cursory investigation into Vince's disappearance had failed to uncover the truth. While the apology came decades too late to help Vince or spare his family years of anguish, it represented a public acknowledgement of corporate responsibility that meant something to Clara. Companies want to pretend that past wrongs aren't their problem if they've changed hands or restructured, Clara said, but they benefited from the profits generated by operations like Clearwater Camp, including the fraudulent profits Pickens skimmed. They have a moral obligation to acknowledge the human cost of how those profits were made. This apology doesn't change what happened, but it matters that they said it. The forensic examination of Vince's remains also revealed details about his final moments that, while painful for his family to learn, provided a complete picture of what had transpired that October night. The patterns of injury showed that Vince had fought back vigorously against his attacker, confirming the narrative Helen's letter had suggested. Defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, fractures consistent with blocking or deflecting blows, all painted a picture of a young man who'd refused to give up even when facing overwhelming force. He didn't go quietly, Dr. Chen noted in his report. The victim demonstrated considerable courage and determination in trying to survive the attack. While ultimately unsuccessful, his resistance may have contributed to his killer's decision to bury him in such a panicked, inadequate manner. A more composed killer might have disposed of the body more effectively. That inadequate disposal, combined with Helen Pickens Rourke's eventual decision to document what she knew, had ultimately led to justice being served. If Pickens had been more thorough, if Helen had taken her knowledge to the grave without leaving the letter, if Rachel Feng had passed over that trunk at the estate sale, if the forest fire had never swept through the area, the truth might have remained buried indefinitely. The convergence of all these factors, each necessary but insufficient on its own, demonstrated how solving cold cases often required equal parts skill, persistence, and luck. The site where Vince's body had been found became, informally, a place of reflection and remembrance. While there was no official memorial, people began leaving small tokens near where the equipment shed had stood. Flowers appeared regularly, particularly on October 14th, the anniversary of Vince's death. Notes were left, many from young people expressing admiration for his courage or sharing their own stories of trying to stand up against injustice. The Forest Service eventually installed a simple bench nearby with a small plaque that read, "In memory of those who spoke truth to power." Clara visited the site once, accompanied by her children and grandchildren. She'd waited until spring, when the burned landscape had begun to show signs of recovery, when green shoots pushed up through the ash-covered soil and birdsong filled the air. Standing in the place where her brother had died, she felt a complex mixture of emotions, grief certainly, but also a strange sense of completion. "This is where it ended for him," she told her family, her voice steady despite her tears. "But it's also where the truth began to come back to light. The fire that exposed his remains was terrible, destructive, but it also served a purpose. Sometimes things have to burn before they can grow again. Sometimes secrets have to be destroyed before healing can begin. Her granddaughter, a college student studying forensic science and inspired by Vince's story, asked if it bothered Clara that Pickens had never faced criminal prosecution, that he'd died believing he'd gotten away with murder. Clara considered the question carefully before answering. "Justice takes many forms," she finally said. "Yes, I wish Pickens had faced trial, had been forced to answer for what he did. But he lived with the guilt, according to his sister's account. He drank heavily, suffered from nightmares, was haunted by what he'd done. That's not nothing, even if it's not a courtroom conviction." And ultimately, the truth came out. Pickens's name is now permanently associated with cowardly murder and corruption. His reputation is destroyed. Meanwhile, Vince is remembered as a hero who died for his principles. In the court of history, justice has been served. The story of Vincent Harper resonated particularly strongly with young people entering the workforce. Those navigating the sometimes treacherous waters of workplace politics and power dynamics for the first time. On social media platforms, Vince's story was shared widely, often accompanied by discussions about workplace ethics and the importance of speaking up. Several companies began using the case in their ethics training programs as an extreme example of what could happen when whistleblower protections failed and when supervisory power went unchecked. Labor historians place the Harper case in broader context, showing how it represented a particular moment in Canadian industrial history when remote work camps operated with minimal oversight and when workers had few protections against abusive supervisors. The conditions that enabled Pickens to commit murder and cover it up for decades were products of their time, but elements of those conditions persisted in various forms, making Vince's story not just historical, but cautionary. Professor Linda Ashworth, a sociologist at McGill University who specialized in workplace dynamics, wrote extensively about the Harper case. What makes this story particularly compelling, she argued in a widely read academic paper, is that it demonstrates the potential consequences of even low-level corporate corruption. Pickens started with relatively small-scale theft, skimming supplies and inflating figures. But once he'd crossed that ethical line, once he'd committed to protecting his fraudulent activities, he became capable of much greater crimes. The murder of Vincent Harper wasn't a separate evil from the accounting fraud. It was the logical extension of a mentality that prioritized self-interest over all moral considerations. The psychological profile of Howard Pickens, constructed posthumously by forensic psychologists consulting with the RCMP, painted a picture of a man whose sense of entitlement and grandiosity had grown unchecked over decades. Early in his career, Pickens had likely rationalized his theft as merely taking what he deserved as compensation for hard work in harsh conditions. But as the stealing continued and escalated, it became less about perceived fairness and more about power and control. By the time he killed Vince Harper, Pickens had developed a worldview where his own interests justified any action, where a young man's life was worth less than protecting his reputation and financial scheme. We see this pattern repeatedly in cases of workplace violence, noted Dr. Sarah Brennan, a criminal psychologist who studied the Harper case. An individual begins with rationalized rule-breaking, progresses to more serious violations, and eventually reaches a point where violence seems like a reasonable option to protect their interests. What makes Pickens particularly chilling is how effectively he maintained a facade of normalcy while harboring this capacity for lethal violence. His co-workers, for the most part, saw him as a tough but competent boss. Only a few, like Marcus DeLuca, sensed the danger lurking beneath the surface. The case also highlighted advances in forensic science that had occurred over the 66 years between Vince's death and the discovery of his remains. Techniques like DNA analysis, isotope testing, and advanced radiographic imaging had all been unavailable in 1958, but they proved crucial in confirming the identity of the remains and establishing details about what had happened. The case served as a powerful advertisement for maintaining cold case units and continuing to apply new technologies to old mysteries. For Rachel Fung, the experience of discovering the confession letter and triggering the investigation had been transformative. Her doctoral dissertation evolved to focus specifically on the Harper case and what it revealed about power structures in mid-century resource industries. The thesis won awards and was eventually published as a book that became required reading in labor studies programs across Canada. Rachel credited Vince Harper with changing the trajectory of her academic career and her understanding of how individual courage could challenge institutional power. Researching this case taught me that history isn't just about grand movements and famous leaders, Rachel wrote in the book's introduction. It's also about ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in decisive moments. Vince Harper was a 21-year-old logger with a high school education, not a famous activist or powerful politician. But his decision to stand up against corruption, even knowing it could cost him his job, demonstrated a moral clarity that many people in positions of much greater power never achieve. His story deserves to be told not just as a cautionary tale about workplace violence, but as an inspiring example of integrity in action. As the years passed following the resolution of the case, Vince Harper's story continued to evolve in the public imagination. He became a folk hero of sorts, particularly in Alberta's working-class communities, a symbol of resistance against authority and corporate malfeasance. Annual memorial services were held in Medicine Hat on the anniversary of his birth, bringing together labor activists, social justice advocates, and ordinary citizens who saw their own struggles reflected in his story.